The rain turned the runway into black glass, slick and lightless, reflecting nothing but tension back into the room. I stood one step behind the map table while voices overlapped. Routes, weather windows, fuel margins, each one louder than the last. No one looked at me. Someone dragged a chair across the floor and parked it in front of my spot, like I was excess equipment taking up space. Another voice, not unkind, but final, told me to wait outside. They said I did not fly anymore. They said command pulled me after the crash. They said paperwork was safer for someone like me. I did not argue. I watched the windsock snap hard to the left, the kind of movement pilots notice before storms close doors. I listened to the radio spill fear from the mountains. Men pinned down, voices clipped and tight, wounded stacking up faster than anyone wanted to say out loud. The weather was collapsing quicker than the forecast had promised. The primary pilot was still not in the room, and time was already deciding who would bleed and who would not. Then the word came down. The pilot was grounded. The room went quiet. Everyone started searching for an answer. No one was looking at the woman already holding the keys. Subscribe to my channel, Lady Veteran Stories, for more real military stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I should have introduced myself earlier, but the truth is, no one asked. My name is Captain Ava Monroe. I am a rescue helicopter pilot, or I was, stationed at a small Army airfield tucked outside a forgotten desert town most people pass without noticing. The year was 2014, and the deployment had been sold to us as quiet work training rotations, standby medical evacuation, weather monitoring, nothing headline-worthy. The kind of assignment people use to catch their breath between harder tours. I had learned not to trust words like quiet. The airfield sat low against a stretch of high desert that looked calm until it decided not to be. Mountains rose sharp and uneven to the west, cutting radio signals and funneling weather into sudden, violent shifts. During the day, the heat pressed down until metal burned skin. At night, the cold slipped in fast, carrying wind that found every loose seam. We trained constantly, because terrain like that does not forgive hesitation. I flew rescue. That meant short notices, bad conditions, and decisions that had to be made before fear finished its sentence. I had been flying since I was 22 years old. I trusted muscle memory more than optimism. I trusted preparation more than confidence. I trusted silence in a cockpit more than any speech. And then there was the crash. It happened months before this night, during a routine training flight that went wrong in a way investigations like to call a convergence of factors. Mechanical failure paired with sudden weather. Hard choices made fast. We survived. Everyone walked away. The aircraft did not. The board cleared me of fault in clean, official language, but clearance does not erase discomfort. Someone has to carry doubt, and that someone is usually the pilot. They pulled me from the roster. Temporarily, they said. For rest, for review, for safety. I was reassigned to planning support, flight coordination, anything that kept my boots on the ground and my hands off the controls. People spoke carefully around me like volume might reopen old damage. They told me it was not personal. It always is. Being reassigned sounds like relief until you realize how quiet your days become. You stop counting minutes by fuel burn and start counting them by paperwork. You stop feeling useful. You stop being needed. That kind of silence is heavier than rotor wash. I stayed professional. I showed up early. I studied routes and weather patterns harder than before. I listened on the radio even when it was not my shift. I did not ask when I would fly again. Then the call came in from beyond the ridgeline. A platoon had been moving through broken terrain during a night reposition when contact found them. The mountains played games with sound, making distance hard to judge. Enemy fire was steady, not panicked. That kind of fire means patience. It means planning. Several soldiers were down, injuries serious enough that waiting was not an option. The extraction window was narrow and shrinking, squeezed by terrain and a storm system moving faster than predicted. Weather reports started changing by the minute. Ceilings dropped. Wind shifted through the passes in sharp, unpredictable bursts. Every option on the board came with risk. I stood near the map table and watched the room tighten. Officers spoke faster. Radios crackled with updates no one liked hearing. Someone mentioned delaying until first light. Someone else shut that down immediately. First light was too far away. The primary pilot had not arrived yet. When he did, it was clear something was wrong. Medical had grounded him before his helmet hit the table. No debate, no appeal. That was when the room stalled. People flipped through names, availability, qualifications. Every answer came with a problem attached. Weather minimums, crew rest limits, experience gaps. I knew the terrain better than most of them. I had flown that valley in daylight and darkness, calm skies, and bad ones. I had studied its winds because I had been stuck on the ground long enough to memorize them, but I was not on the list. I felt the weight settle then, not anger, not resentment, responsibility. I was still a pilot. My hands still knew what to do. The aircraft did not care about reputation. The wounded did not care about reassignment memos. They cared about time. I realized something standing there, watching the clock eat away options. I did not need belief. I needed a chance. And sometimes, in the military, those are not the same thing. Major Melissa Grant was running the room, and I could see the strain in the way she kept her shoulders squared, like posture alone could hold the night together. She had too many variables stacked in front of her and not enough time to sort them cleanly. Her voice stayed level, but the pace was off. Slides flipped too fast. Questions overlapped answers. The briefing felt compressed, like we were trying to force certainty where there was not enough air for it. Captain Erin Caldwell stood near the weatherboard, one hand resting on the edge like she was bracing herself. She was good at her job, careful, precise. She did not dramatize conditions or soften them either. When she spoke, she chose her words the way pilots choose landing zones. She warned about ceiling collapse along the western face of the ridge. She mentioned wind shear funneling through the higher passes, unpredictable and sharp. She pointed out the storm cell building behind the mountains, the one moving faster than earlier models suggested. Her warnings landed, but they did not stop anything. Optimism has weight in rooms like that. It sounds like confidence. It feels like leadership. It is dangerous because it convinces people they are in control when they are only hopeful. Someone countered that the weather was still within limits. Someone else said they had flown worse. Another voice reminded the room that the wounded did not have the luxury of waiting for perfect conditions. All of that was true, but it was not the whole truth. I stood back, listening, watching the map fill with lines and arrows. The plotted route cut straight through a narrow pass between two ridgelines, the kind that looks efficient on paper and punishing in real air. I traced it with my eyes, noting the elevation changes, the choke points, the places where wind liked to bounce instead of flow. I had flown that pass before. I knew how quickly it turned from manageable to hostile when storms pressed in from the west. I noticed the storm line creeping closer on the weather display, its edge blurring in a way that meant acceleration. I noticed how often people said should instead of will. I noticed how many assumptions were being stacked together and labeled as plan. No one was careless. That was the problem. Everyone was competent, experienced, and certain that competence would carry them through. They were filling the gaps with confidence instead of information. I waited for a pause that never came. When I spoke, it was not loud. It was not emotional. It was specific. I pointed to the map and suggested an alternate valley approach, one that curved south before turning back in under the storm line. It was longer, slower, but it avoided the worst of the wind shear and gave more room to maneuver if visibility dropped. I mentioned terrain masking. I mentioned known downdraft zones. I explained how the valley walls there tended to steady wind instead of compress it. I did not say I should fly it. I just said it would work better. For a moment, I thought the room might stop. It did not. Someone nodded politely without really looking at the map. Someone said they would consider it if conditions worsened. Another voice jumped in about fuel margins and time lost on the ground. The discussion rolled right over my words, like they had been background noise instead of a warning. I stepped back again. It was not hostility. No one was angry. No one dismissed me outright. It was something more dangerous than that. It was certainty, the kind that does not feel the need to listen because it already believes it understands. Major Grant kept moving forward, assigning tasks, confirming checklists, pushing momentum. I did not blame her. Momentum is comforting when everything else is unstable. Stopping feels like failure. Captain Caldwell caught my eye briefly. There was no drama in her look. Just acknowledgement. She had heard me. She knew what I meant. But weather officers do not fly aircraft, and pilots were already committed to a plan. The radio crackled again. The ground unit came through with an update that tightened the room further. More wounded than initially reported. Bleeding controlled, but not stable. Ammunition low. Contact continuing. Time compressed. I felt that familiar pull then, the one that starts in the chest and settles into the hands. The quiet understanding that if the plan failed, it would not fail loudly. It would fail in small increments, lost visibility here, delayed approach there, until suddenly it was too late to correct. I looked at the aircraft through the rain-streaked windows. I thought about the valley I had described, the way the wind curled low along its floor, the way the terrain opened just enough near the extraction point to give a pilot options instead of demands. I thought about how plans built on certainty break faster than plans built on caution. The room kept moving. I stayed still. Not because I had nothing else to say, but because saying it again would not change anything yet. In the military, timing matters as much as truth. Speak too early, and you are ignored. Speak too late, and you are blamed. I watched the clock. I listened to the weather updates tighten. I listened to the radio voices from the mountains grow shorter, more controlled, the way voices do when fear is being managed instead of expressed. Certainty filled the room like armor, and armor is heavy when you have to turn fast. The first aircraft lifted and disappeared into the rain, rotors fading into the low cloud ceiling. Less than 15 minutes later, the radio crackled with a tight, clipped voice calling abort. Visibility had collapsed faster than expected. The crew could not maintain reference through the pass. They turned back before the terrain made the decision for them. When the aircraft landed, no one spoke much. An abort is not failure, but it is never neutral. It tightens everything that comes after. The room shifted. Shoulders rose. Voices dropped. The plan was no longer theoretical. Radio traffic from the ground unit started to fracture, messages stepping over each other, pauses stretching too long between replies. Call signs repeated. Coordinates confirmed twice. Casualties were mentioned without detail. That was always worse than specifics. When people stop describing injuries, it usually means they are prioritizing hands over words. It means blood is involved. It means time is already behind. I stayed busy, not because anyone told me to, but because standing still felt wrong. I moved through the hangar and the staging area, checking what I could without interrupting anyone. I caught a fuel log discrepancy before it turned into a delay. I adjusted a harness that had been sized too loose for a litter patient. I laid out night gear the way I always had, ordered, reachable, nothing stacked where it could fall when the aircraft pitched. I did not announce what I was doing. I just did it. Staff Sergeant Danielle Ruiz noticed. She was the senior flight medic, the kind who moved with calm economy, every step purposeful, no wasted motion. She had worked more mass casualty runs than she liked to remember. When she saw me prepping the cabin, securing straps, clearing floor space, setting up anchor points for litters, she paused. Not long, just long enough to clock it. "You expecting wounded?" she asked. "Always," I said. She did not ask why I was doing it instead of someone else. She just nodded and adjusted her own checklist to match mine. From then on, she watched me differently, not suspicious. Assessing, like someone recognizing a shared language. The radio squawked again. The ground unit came through broken, transmission cutting in and out as terrain chewed the signal. Contact still ongoing, ammunition low. Evac needed soon, very soon. Another aircraft prepped to go. Another route. Another calculation. The weather officer's updates were less cautious now and more urgent. Ceiling dropping across the ridgeline. Wind shear confirmed at higher elevations. The storm was no longer approaching. It was here. Someone made a joke near the back of the room, something about how support staff always worked harder than the flyers. A few people laughed, the kind of laugh meant to relieve pressure, not insult. The comment brushed past me like grit. I let it pass. Correcting it would have taken energy better spent elsewhere. Inside, the weight built. Not anger, not resentment. Responsibility. Responsibility feels different. It is quieter. It settles in the chest and stays there, heavy but steady. It is the understanding that you see something others might not, and that seeing it makes you accountable whether you are asked to be or not. I checked the aircraft again, the one sitting dark at the edge of the hangar, the one I knew best. I ran my hand along the fuselage, feeling the cold metal under the rain. I thought about the valley route I had mentioned earlier, the way the wind behaved there, the way the terrain opened just enough to give options. I thought about the men waiting in the mountains, managing fear by narrowing their focus to the next task, the next breath. Major Grant moved fast, issuing updates, adjusting assignments. She was doing everything right under impossible conditions. I respected that. Leadership in moments like this is less about perfection and more about motion. Stillness can kill. The aborted crew moved off to debrief, faces tight but composed. No one lingered. No one needed to say what everyone was thinking. Options were shrinking. Staff Sergeant Ruiz finished loading medical gear and gave me a look, not a question. A check. I met it with a nod. The cabin was ready. If wounded came aboard, they would have what they needed the moment they crossed the threshold. Another radio call came through, weaker than before. The ground unit's voice shook just slightly before steadying again. They were buying time with discipline. Discipline runs out faster than people admit. I glanced at the clock. Not because I was counting minutes, but because I was measuring how much margin remained. It was not much. Around me, people moved faster now, checklists shortened. Conversations tightened, the kind of efficiency that comes right before decisions get forced. I did not feel overlooked anymore. I felt positioned. Responsibility does that. It does not ask for permission. It waits until the moment arrives when it becomes unavoidable. And I knew, with a clarity that surprised me by its calm, that moment was close. The mission started to tip, not all at once, but in the way heavy things do when their balance finally gives. The primary pilot arrived late, rain still dripping from his jacket, helmet tucked under his arm like he had forgotten it mattered. His eyes were unfocused, movements just a half step behind his thoughts. No one said anything at first. No one had to. Medical caught it immediately. They pulled him aside, ran a quick check, asked questions that did not need answers. Fatigue. Dehydration. Something deeper he was trying to muscle through. The verdict came down fast and clean. He was grounded. No negotiation, no argument. Safety was not optional. The room stalled hard. It was the kind of pause that feels louder than shouting. People looked at the board, at the aircraft list, at each other. Names were tossed out, then crossed off just as quickly. Crew rest issues. Qualification gaps. Pilots who knew the airframe but not the terrain. Pilots who knew the terrain but had not flown in conditions like this. Every option came with a reason it might fail. Time bled away in small, invisible cuts. The radio cracked again, and this time the voice from the ground did not bother hiding the strain. Contact was closer now. Voices in the background shouted coordinates and warnings. Someone yelled to keep low. Someone else yelled a name. Fear was no longer being managed. It was being worked around. The room tightened further. I felt the weight settle fully then, heavy and unmistakable. This was no longer a question of fairness or process or waiting my turn. This was about whether someone was going to get lifted off that mountain or not. I stepped forward. When I spoke this time, I did not hedge. I did not soften. I did not wait for a pause that would never come. I pointed at the map and spoke in plain language. I explained the valley approach again, slower this time, not as a suggestion, but as a solution. I traced the route with my finger, describing how the terrain shielded the aircraft from the worst of the wind. I explained where the downdrafts formed and where they did not. I talked about sightlines, escape options, hover margins. I explained why the narrow pass everyone favored would turn lethal if the ceiling dropped another 100 feet, which the weather updates said it would. I did not talk about what I had flown before. I talked about what the aircraft could do now. I explained why this route gave us room to think instead of forcing us to react. For a moment, the room slowed. Then it moved on again. Someone said the alternate valley would add time. Someone else worried about fuel margins. Another voice said the storm could still cut us off on the return. All valid points, all incomplete. Major Grant listened, nodded once, and then redirected the discussion, not dismissive, decisive. She was trying to hold the room together, to keep momentum alive, to make something happen before the window closed completely. And just like that, my words were set aside again. I stepped back, not because I agreed, but because I understood something had changed. Waiting was no longer neutral. Every second spent hoping someone else would choose differently was a second stolen from the people bleeding in the mountains. The plan on the board was brittle, built on assumptions that no longer held. I could feel it the way pilots feel vibration before an instrument confirms it. The situation was about to force a decision, and forced decisions are rarely the best ones. I looked at the aircraft again. I looked at Staff Sergeant Ruiz, already securing straps tighter, checking equipment like she expected to move. She met my eyes without question. She had heard everything. She had seen the abort. She knew what time sounded like when it ran out. I realized then that permission was not coming. Not because I did not deserve it, not because I was wrong, but because institutions move slower than weather and rank cannot always outrun consequence. I thought about the crash months earlier, about how carefully I had waited then, about how following every rule had not saved me from being sidelined anyway, about how survival sometimes comes from doing exactly what you are trained to do, even when the room hesitates. The radio squawked again. A shout cut through the static. Someone was hit again. That was it. I did not raise my voice. I did not announce anything. I simply moved. I walked toward the aircraft with purpose, not urgency. Urgency makes mistakes. Purpose keeps things clean. I reached the cockpit, climbed in, and began the pre-flight from memory. Hands steady, breathing even. Every switch where it should be, every check in the right order. Behind me, voices rose. Someone called my name. Someone else told me to wait. I did not. Because there are moments when waiting stops being professionalism and starts being avoidance. Moments when responsibility demands action, not approval. This was one of those moments, and I was done standing behind the map table. Chaos pressed in from every direction at once. the kind that does not announce itself, but tightens space until there is nowhere left to stand still. The weather dropped hard, faster than the last update had warned. Ceiling collapsed in uneven sheets, visibility thinning into something granular and unreliable. Wind shifted through the ridgelines exactly where I had said it would, slamming into the hangar doors in sharp bursts that rattled metal and nerves alike. The room reacted too late. Weather updates started coming faster, each one worse than the last. Wind shear confirmed along the planned route, visibility degrading below comfortable margins. The storm was no longer theoretical. It was present, active, impatient. I finished the pre-flight without rushing. Rushing is how people forget small things, and small things end missions. My hands moved the way they always had, muscle memory steady and exact. Fuel checked. Systems, green. Controls free and clear. The aircraft felt solid under me, familiar in a way nothing else in the room did. That was when I saw Chief Warrant Officer Ritt Daly standing near the hangar entrance. He was an instructor pilot passing through the base, the kind who carried years without wearing them loudly. He had been quiet all night, observing more than participating. When our eyes met, he did not speak. He did not step in front of anyone or raise a hand. He just gave me a small nod. It was recognition without endorsement, acknowledgement without permission. He saw what I saw. He understood the moment for what it was. That nod settled something in me, not confidence. Confirmation. Behind me, movement picked up again. The room was trying to catch up to the situation, voices overlapping, authority recalculating itself in real time. Someone called for a co-pilot. The list was shorter now, much shorter. Captain Noah Bennett was assigned almost by default. He climbed into the right seat with the careful movements of someone who knew he was being watched. He was competent, qualified, smart. He had trained well. But he was young, and this was not the flight he had imagined when he learned the aircraft. His hands shook just enough to notice when he strapped in. His jaw tightened as he ran his checks a half beat too fast. I did not comment. Fear does not need to be called out to be managed. It needs structure. It needs rhythm. It needs someone else to remain calm long enough for it to follow. I spoke to him evenly, voice low, explaining nothing that did not need explaining. I told him what I expected from him and when. I told him where I would need him to watch and where I would need silence. He nodded, grateful for the clarity, grateful not to be questioned about how he felt. Outside, the wind howled across the tarmac, rain now coming sideways, driven hard enough to sting exposed skin. The storm had arrived fully, impatient and loud. The room still hesitated. Major Grant stood near the table, hands braced, eyes moving between the weatherboard and the aircraft. I could see the calculation behind her eyes, the conflict between regulation and reality. She was waiting for one more piece of information, one more confirmation that would make the decision clean. It was not coming. The radio squawked again. The ground unit came through fractured, breathless. Contact was closer than before. Movement restricted, casualties worsening. The words tumbled over each other, discipline fraying at the edges. Lives do not wait for clean decisions. I did not announce that we were going. I did not look back at the room for approval. I started the engines. The familiar whine built under my feet, vibrations settling into something I could feel and trust. Gauges came alive. The aircraft responded the way it always had, indifferent to the noise and tension around it. The cockpit narrowed into focus. The world outside reduced to what mattered. Someone shouted from behind us. Someone else told me to hold. I did not. I brought the power up smoothly, feeling the aircraft lighten, testing the response against the wind. Gusts shoved at us, sharp and impatient, exactly where the map said they would. I compensated without thinking, adjusting collective and pedals in practiced rhythm. The aircraft held. Captain Bennett followed my movements closely, fear giving way to concentration. His breathing steadied. His hands matched mine when needed, stayed out of the way when not. Chief Warrant Officer Daly stepped back as we edged forward, clearing space without a word. Staff Sergeant Ruiz was already strapped in the back, gear secured, body braced. She did not ask if we were cleared. She knew. I keyed the radio and called our movement with calm precision, not asking, not declaring, informing. Words chosen carefully, professionally, enough to be heard, not enough to invite debate. The rain streaked across the windshield, visibility shrinking into a tunnel of motion and sound. Wind slapped the fuselage, testing our balance. I held it steady, adjusting continuously, not fighting the storm but moving with it. The aircraft lifted. The moment the skids left the ground, the room behind us stopped mattering. The hesitation, the debate, the certainty that had stalled everything, all of it fell away beneath the rising noise of the rotors. Ahead of us lay dark terrain, collapsing weather, and men who were running out of time. That was enough. I pushed us forward into the storm, not because I was reckless, not because I was defiant, but because this was the exact moment my training had been meant for. And I was done waiting. The moment did not announce itself. There was no pause, no dramatic silence. I climbed into the left seat the way I had done hundreds of times before, without asking, without explaining. The door closed. The world narrowed. My hands found the controls automatically, familiar as breath. Switches clicked in sequence. Gauges came alive. Power rose under my palms, a steady vibration that settled straight into muscle memory. Everything slowed. Behind us, the room froze. I felt it more than I heard it. The sudden stillness, the break in voices, the way movement stopped mid-step. People realized what was happening all at once, but no one reacted fast enough to stop it. The aircraft was already awake. The checklist was already flowing. The machine did not care who approved what. It responded only to inputs. Rain hammered the canopy. Wind shoved against the fuselage, impatient and sharp. I adjusted without thinking, compensating instinctively, feeling the aircraft balance itself under my hands. This was where I belonged. Not at the map table, not in the margins. Here, the hangar doors flew open then, pushed wide by a gust and a figure moving fast through the rain. Colonel James Hargrove stepped inside, coat soaked through, boots tracking water across the concrete. He demanded answers before he was fully through the door, voice sharp with urgency and authority. He wanted to know why aircraft were spinning up without clearance. He wanted to know who had made the call. Then he saw me. He stopped mid-stride. For a brief moment, the storm outside seemed quieter, like the world itself was holding its breath. The colonel stared at the cockpit, eyes narrowing not in anger but recognition. He knew exactly who I was. He knew my record. He knew the investigation. He knew the whispers that followed me like static. He also knew my flight hours, my evaluations, the kind of pilot I had been before doubt found me. He did not ask why I was there. He did not ask who authorized it. He looked at the weatherboard, at the clock, at the radio flashing with unanswered calls. He looked at the aircraft straining gently against the brakes, eager to move. Then he looked back at me. "You're flying," he said. That was it. No speech, no warning, no debate. One clean sentence, delivered with finality. Clearance given not because it was comfortable, but because it was necessary. Years of quiet judgment evaporated in that moment. Years of careful distance. Years of being useful but unseen. Gone with a single decision made under rain and pressure. I did not pause to feel it. There was no time. I acknowledged the clearance, voice calm, professional, already moving on to the next step. Brakes released, power adjusted. The aircraft rolled forward, rain streaking sideways across the canopy, visibility shrinking into a narrow corridor of motion. Captain Bennett in the right seat followed my lead without hesitation now. His fear had sharpened into focus, his movements precise, his trust placed exactly where it needed to be. Staff Sergeant Ruiz braced in the back, gear secured, posture steady. Everyone was ready because readiness had finally found direction. The storm fought us immediately. Wind slammed into the aircraft from the left, trying to shove us offline. I countered smoothly, not forcing it, letting the machine settle into the pressure instead of resisting it. Rotor wash kicked up sheets of water from the tarmac, turning the world into motion and noise. I lifted us gently, testing the hover, feeling for instability, listening to what the aircraft told me instead of what I wanted to hear. It held, I corrected. It held again. We climbed. We climbed. The base fell away beneath us, lights blurring through rain and mist. The hangar shrank behind, the frozen room left with its questions and second-guessing. Ahead lay black terrain and weather that did not care about rank or reputation. I set our course toward the valley I had described, the one that bent away from the storm before slipping back under its edge. The wind hit us exactly where predicted, rough but manageable. Turbulence jostled the cabin, sharp and insistent, but nothing the aircraft could not handle when flown deliberately. I kept my breathing even, my focus narrow, no room for relief. No room for validation, only the next input, the next correction, the next decision layered cleanly on top of the last. The radio crackled, ground forces confirming our approach with disbelief edging their voices. They had not expected to hear a helicopter pushing through conditions like this. I did not reassure them with promises. I gave them facts. Estimated arrival. Approach direction. What to prepare for. The storm closed in around us, visibility tightening, rain hammering the canopy hard enough to feel like impact. I adjusted again, trusting the aircraft, trusting the route, trusting the hours I had earned long before anyone questioned me. We lifted higher, then dipped into the valley shelter, wind smoothing just enough to give us breathing room. The terrain opened ahead, dark and jagged, waiting. Behind us, a base full of people exhaled. Ahead of us, men waited in the mountains. I did not think about what had just been erased. I did not think about what had been given back. Those thoughts could come later, if they came at all. Right then, there was only flight, and the wounded were still not home. The flight settled into a hard, deliberate quiet, the kind that comes when everyone understands there is no room left for noise. I flew the valley exactly the way I said we should, easing us down into its curve, letting the terrain do what it had done long before any of us arrived. Break the wind, blunt the storm's reach, give us a narrow corridor where control was still possible. The mountains rose on either side, dark and close, but they worked for us now instead of against us. The storm did not give up. It pressed from above and behind, rain hammering the canopy, turbulence reaching down in sharp, impatient grabs. I countered continuously, small corrections layered over each other, never fighting the aircraft, never forcing it to do more than it could. The valley smoothed the worst of it just enough, exactly as predicted. In the back, the cabin was tight with tension and purpose. Staff Sergeant Ruiz moved with practiced economy, bracing herself as the aircraft bucked, hands already reaching for straps and gear before the skids were fully down. Lieutenant Chloe Park was beside her, younger but steady, eyes focused, jaw set. Blood showed fast under red light, darker than it looked in daylight. She did not hesitate or flinch. She did not look up until she was done with what was in front of her. I brought us into the hover slowly, carefully, testing the air. The aircraft strained immediately, power margins thinning, rotors biting into unstable wind that snapped and shifted without warning. Below us, muzzle flashes cut through the darkness, sharp and sudden. Fire snapped upward, not accurate, but close enough to remind us how little space we had. I held the hover anyway, not stubbornly, not defiantly, precisely. Every input mattered, collective, adjusted by inches. Pedals balanced against yaw, cyclic steady, correcting just enough to keep us centered without chasing movement. The aircraft groaned under the effort, vibrations running through the frame, but it stayed where I told it to stay. The first wounded came up fast. Hands reached, straps locked. Weight shifted. I compensated without looking, feeling the change through the controls. The second followed. Then the third. Each one heavier than the last, not just in pounds, but in what they carried with them. Pain, fear, the simple need to still be alive when this was over. Fire cracked again below. Someone shouted. Someone else shouted back. I did not look down. Looking down changes nothing. Flying does. Almost done, Ruiz called forward, voice calm even as the aircraft trembled. I adjusted again, holding the hover through another gust that tried to shove us sideways. The valley walls caught part of it, broke it just enough. The plan held because it had been built for this moment, not for comfort. The last wounded came aboard. Straps locked, doors closed. Clear, Ruiz said. I did not respond. I was already pulling power, easing us out of the hover, letting the aircraft climb only when it was ready. We cleared the extraction zone cleanly, climbing back into the valley's shelter as the storm snapped at our tail. Only then did I let my breathing deepen. The return flight was heavier. It always is, not just because of the added weight, though that mattered, but because survival has mass. It sits in the cabin with you. It fills the air with things no one says. Relief mixed with grief. Success shadowed by what almost happened. The medics worked steadily, voices low, movement sure. Lieutenant Park's gloves were dark now, slick with effort. She stayed focused, adjusting lines, checking vitals, doing exactly what needed to be done without drama. Captain Bennett flew with me in silence, his movements confident now, fear burned away by purpose. He followed every cue, anticipated corrections, trusted the rhythm we had found. He did not need reassurance anymore. He had crossed that line where experience stops being theoretical. The storm followed us part of the way back, stubborn and loud, but the valley kept doing its job. When we finally climbed out of its protection, the wind hit us hard again, testing our margins one last time. I answered with the same calm precision, nothing wasted, nothing forced. The base came into view through rain and mist, lights blurred but steady. I brought us down smoothly, touching the tarmac without ceremony, without flourish. The rotors wound down as medics moved fast, ground crews swarming in practiced silence. We shut down, no cheers, no speeches, just movement, stretchers rolling, boots splashing through water, hands clapping shoulders once before moving on. That was enough. I sat in the left seat for a moment longer, hands resting on the controls, feeling the aircraft settle fully into stillness. The storm continued around us, indifferent, already moving on to whatever came next. We had brought them all home. That was the job. And survival, heavy as it is, was finally off our wings. I shut down the aircraft the same way I always do. Switches in order. Hands steady. Breathing slow. There is no applause waiting for us, no raised voices, no sense of victory. Just the sound of rain on metal, boots moving with purpose, radios clicking off one by one. Paperwork starts immediately. It always does. And with each signature, the weight lifts a little more from everyone's shoulders. People treat me differently after that night. Quieter, more deliberate, more deliberate. Some avoid my eyes. A few apologize in ways that feel unfinished. Most do not say anything at all. That is fine. What stays with me is not the dismissal or the doubt. It is how close hesitation came to costing lives. How easily competence gets overlooked when it does not fit expectation. How dangerous certainty becomes when it refuses to listen. Women in the military learn this early. We learn to carry skill without announcing it. To stay steady when rooms get loud and confident. to prepare without recognition and act without permission when the moment demands it. We learn that leadership does not always come from rank, and courage does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like knowing when to move. I did not fly that night to reclaim a reputation or silence whispers. I did not fly to prove I still belonged in the cockpit. I flew because they were wounded waiting in the dark. I flew because time was running out. I flew because someone had to bring them home. Subscribe to my channel, Lady Veteran Stories, for more real military stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from.